The voicemail was waiting when I got home from the grocery store. I almost didn't listen to it. At 57, most of my calls are automated reminders about dental appointments or credit card offers. But something made me press play while I was putting away the milk. A woman's voice, businesslike but tentative. She said she was calling from Riverside Medical Center in Sacramento. She said they had a patient in long-term care who'd been brought in from a hospice facility, and they were trying to locate next of kin. She said the patient's name was Jennifer Holloway. That was my sister's name. I stood there in the kitchen holding a bag of apples, listening to the message a second time. The woman left a callback number and asked me to reach out as soon as possible. She said it was urgent. Jennifer died in 1988. She was 11 years old. Leukemia. I was 13 when we buried her in the cemetery outside Modesto, in a plot next to our grandparents. I'd visited that grave for 35 years. I set the apples down and called the number. The woman who answered introduced herself as Linda Voss, a patient advocate. She sounded relieved to hear from me. She asked if I was related to Jennifer Holloway, date of birth April 2, 1977. I said yes. That was my sister's birthday. She paused, and I heard her typing. Then she said, "We have a Jennifer Holloway here who was transferred from Maplewood Hospice 3 days ago. She's in her late 40s, nonverbal. In advanced stages of care. We've been trying to locate family for medical decision-making purposes. Your name and contact information came up in her intake records as next of kin." I told her there must be a mistake. I told her my sister died when she was 11. Linda went quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can you come to the hospital? I think it would be better if we talked in person." I drove to Sacramento the next morning. It was 2 hours from my house, and I spent the entire drive trying to make sense of it. Mistaken identity, obviously. Someone had used my sister's name. Maybe stolen her identity. I'd heard about that happening. People taking the names of dead children, because there were birth certificates but no active records. I parked in the hospital garage and took the elevator to the 4th floor. Linda met me at the nurse's station. She was in her 50s, with short gray hair and the kind of steady, calm expression that comes from managing difficult conversations every day. She took me to a small office and closed the door. She asked if I wanted water. I said no. She sat down across from me and folded her hands on the desk. She said the patient had been in hospice care for 6 months, admitted from a state psychiatric facility where she'd lived for over 2 decades. She had no visitors on record. No family listed except for an emergency contact, a phone number that led to a disconnected line and eventually, through some digging, to me. I asked how they'd made the connection. Linda said the patient's medical records included a social security number. That number matched Jennifer Holloway's social security number, issued in 1977 in California. I said that didn't make sense. My sister died. We had a death certificate. Linda nodded slowly. She said, "I know this is overwhelming, but I need to ask, is there any chance your sister didn't die? Is there any chance she was taken somewhere, placed in care, and you weren't told?" I stared at her. She said, "It happens more than you'd think, especially decades ago, before digital records. Families were told a child had passed away when in reality they'd been institutionalized. Sometimes it was because of severe disability or behavioral issues. Sometimes it was because families couldn't cope and wanted a way out. I told her my sister had leukemia. I told her I watched her die. I was there in the hospital room. I held her hand. Linda looked at me carefully. She said, "What hospital?" I told her. "St. Agnes, in Fresno." She wrote it down. Then she said, "Would you be willing to see her, the patient here, just to confirm whether or not it's your sister?" I didn't want to. I wanted to leave, to go home, to forget this conversation had ever happened. But I heard myself say yes. Linda led me down the hallway into the hospice wing. The lights were softer here, the sounds muted. She stopped outside a room near the end of the corridor and turned to me. She said, "She's nonverbal and largely unresponsive. She may not recognize you, but take your time." I walked in. The woman in the bed was small and thin, her skin pale and papery. Her hair was gray and brittle, cut short. Her eyes were half open but didn't focus on anything. Machines beeped quietly around her. I looked at her face. I didn't recognize her. But then I saw her left hand resting on the blanket. There was a scar on her wrist, a small crescent shape just below the base of her thumb. Jennifer had the same scar. She'd gotten it when she was 6, falling off her bike onto gravel. I sat down in the chair next to the bed and stared at that scar for a long time. Linda came back in a few minutes later and asked if I was all right. I told her I needed to see the medical records. She said she'd get them. I sat with the woman in the bed, with Jennifer, and tried to understand. I thought about the funeral, the closed casket, my parents standing by the grave, stone, faced and silent, my mother crying into a tissue that she folded and refolded until it fell apart. I thought about the weeks before Jennifer died, how she'd been moved to a different hospital, how my parents had stopped letting me visit, how my father had told me it was better for me to remember her the way she was. I thought about how quickly it had all happened. One day she was sick but talking, and the next day she was gone. Linda came back with a file. She sat down and opened it carefully. She said Jennifer had been admitted to Fairmont State Psychiatric Hospital in 1989, the year after she supposedly died. She'd been transferred from a private care facility in Nevada. The admitting paperwork listed her as a minor with severe developmental disabilities and seizure disorder. The guardian listed on the paperwork was my father. I asked if there was a diagnosis. Linda flipped through the pages. She said the records mentioned a traumatic brain injury sustained during childhood, resulting in cognitive impairment and limited motor function. She said there was no mention of leukemia. I asked if I could see the intake paperwork. She handed it to me. My father's signature was at the bottom, neat and deliberate. The date was March 9, 1989, 3 months after Jennifer's funeral. I sat there staring at his handwriting and felt something inside me go cold and quiet. I asked Linda if she could get me a copy of Jennifer's Social Security records. Anything that showed activity after 1988. She said she'd try. I left the hospital and drove home in a haze. I didn't call anyone. I didn't know what to say. I went into my office, pulled out the box of family documents I kept in the filing cabinet, and found Jennifer's death certificate. It was dated December 3, 1988. Cause of death: acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Attending physician Dr. Harold Nguyen. Location: St. Agnes Medical Center. I looked up Dr. Nguyen. He'd retired in 2003 and passed away in 2012. I called St. Agnes and asked to speak to someone in medical records. After being transferred twice, I reached a woman named Diane who said she'd worked there for 26 years. I explained that I was trying to verify my sister's death in 1988 and asked if they still had records from that time. She said they did, but they were archived. It would take a few days to pull them. I asked her to try. She called me back 4 days later. She said she'd found a record of a Jennifer Holloway admitted to the pediatric oncology unit in October of 1988, but the record ended abruptly in mid-November. There was no discharge summary, no death certificate filed with the hospital, just a notation that the patient had been transferred to another facility at the family's request. I asked what facility. She said it didn't specify. Just private care arrangement. I asked if there was any way to find out more. She said not from her end. She suggested I check with the county coroner's office, since they would have been involved in processing the death certificate. I called the county. I explained the situation to a clerk named Martin who sounded both skeptical and intrigued. He said he'd look into it. He called me back 2 days later. He said he'd found the death certificate on file, but there was a problem. The certificate had been signed by Dr. Nguyen, but there was no corresponding autopsy report, no hospital death summary, and no burial permit issued by the county. I asked how that was possible. He said sometimes paperwork fell through the cracks, especially before digital systems. But he said it was unusual for all 3 documents to be missing. He said there was one other thing. He'd cross-reference the death certificate number with the state database, and the number didn't match any other records. It was as if the certificate had been generated independently. I asked what that meant. He said, very carefully, "It means someone might have falsified it." I sat at my kitchen table that night and made a timeline. I wrote down everything I knew, everything I'd been told, And everything I'd just learned. Jennifer got sick in 1987. She was treated at St. Agnes through 1988. In November of that year, she was transferred out of the hospital to a private care arrangement. In December, my parents told me she'd died. There was a funeral with a closed casket. A death certificate was filed, but no corresponding records existed. 3 months later, Jennifer was admitted to a state psychiatric hospital under my father's guardianship. She lived there for over 20 years before being moved to hospice. I stared at the timeline and felt the weight of it settle into my chest. My parents had lied. They'd told me my sister was dead, held a funeral, and then hidden her away in an institution for the rest of her life. I didn't understand why. Jennifer had been sick? Yes, but she'd been getting treatment. She'd been talking, laughing, asking me to bring her books and magazines. She'd been herself. And then she wasn't. I thought about my father. He'd been a manager at an insurance company, meticulous and controlled. He didn't make mistakes. He didn't act impulsively. If he'd done this, it had been deliberate. I thought about my mother. She'd died 6 years ago, quietly in her sleep. We'd scattered her ashes in the ocean like she'd asked. At the funeral, my father had stood by himself and hadn't cried. My father was still alive. He was 83 now, living in a retirement community in Arizona. I hadn't spoken to him in over a year. We weren't estranged, exactly, but we weren't close. After my mother died, he'd pulled away. He didn't call, didn't visit. Just sent birthday cards with his name signed at the bottom. I called him. He answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was thin and cautious. He asked if everything was all right. I said, I need to ask you about Jennifer. He didn't say anything. I said, I got a call from a hospital in Sacramento. They have a patient named Jennifer Holloway. She's dying. Silence. I said, it's her, isn't it? He exhaled slowly. Then he said, you shouldn't have gone there. I said, why did you lie to me? He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat. He said, she wasn't herself anymore. After the treatments failed, she had seizures. Brain damage. She couldn't speak. Couldn't recognize us. The doctors said she'd need full-time care for the rest of her life. Your mother couldn't handle it. I couldn't handle it. We made a decision. I said, you told me she died. He said, it was easier. I said, easier for who? He didn't answer. I said, you falsified a death certificate. You held a funeral for a child who was still alive. You put her in an institution and walked away. He said, we did what we thought was best. I said, for who? He said, very quietly, for you. I felt something crack inside me. I said, don't put that on me. He said, you were 13. You had your whole life ahead of you. We didn't want you spending it taking care of a sister who would never get better. We didn't want that weight on you. I said, so you carried it alone? He said, yes. I said, and then you forgot about her. He said, I visited, for the first few years. Then it got harder. She didn't know me. She didn't know anyone. It felt like she was already gone. I said, but she wasn't. He didn't respond. I said, she's dying now. For real this time, and she's alone. He said, I can't go there. I said, I'm not asking you to. I hung up. I went back to Sacramento the next day. Linda met me at the hospital and took me to Jennifer's room. I sat with her for hours. I didn't talk. I just sat and watched her breathe. Linda came in later and asked if I wanted to make any decisions about her care. She said Jennifer was on comfort measures only, no life support, but there were still choices to be made: medications, interventions, end-of-life planning. I asked if Jennifer had any legal documents. A will, an advance directive, anything. Linda said no. She said the state had been her legal guardian for years, but now that family had been located, the authority reverted to next of kin. I asked who that was. She said, you. I sat there and absorbed that. I asked what Jennifer's prognosis was. Linda said days, maybe a week. I asked if she was in pain. Linda said they didn't think so. She said Jennifer's brain activity was minimal. She wasn't conscious in any meaningful way. I asked if I could stay. Linda said yes. I stayed for 3 days. I slept in the chair next to Jennifer's bed. I held her hand. I talked to her, even though I didn't think she could hear me. I told her about my life. About my job, my house, my dog. About the places I'd traveled and the things I'd done. I told her I was sorry I hadn't known. I told her I would have come if I had. On the third night, her breathing changed. It became shallow and irregular. Linda came in and checked her vitals. She said it wouldn't be long. Jennifer died at 4 in the morning. I was holding her hand. One moment she was breathing, and the next she wasn't. Linda came in a few minutes later and confirmed it. She asked if I wanted time alone. I said yes. I sat with Jennifer's body for an hour. Then I called the funeral home and made arrangements. I had her cremated. I didn't tell my father. I didn't tell anyone. I drove back to Modesto and went to the cemetery where we'd buried her 35 years ago. I stood in front of the headstone with her name and dates carved into the granite. Jennifer Holloway, 1977-1988. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel sadness. I just felt tired. I opened the urn and scattered her ashes on the grave. The wind caught some of them and carried them across the grass. I watched until they disappeared. I thought about my father and the choice he'd made. I thought about my mother, who'd carried the secret until she died. I thought about all the years Jennifer had spent in places where no one knew her, no one loved her, no one remembered who she'd been before. I thought about the lie I'd lived with for 35 years, and how easily I'd believed it. I didn't forgive my father. I didn't call him again. I didn't go to Arizona. I just let him sit with whatever he was sitting with and moved on. I sold my mother's jewelry, the pieces my father had sent me after she died. I donated the money to a nonprofit that advocates for people in long-term psychiatric care. I didn't tell them why. I just sent the check. I kept one thing. A photograph of Jennifer and me at the beach when we were kids. She's laughing in the picture, her hair wet and tangled, her face bright. I put it on my desk where I can see it. I don't visit the grave anymore. There's no point. She's not there. She never was. But I think about her. I think about the girl she was, and the woman she might have been, and the decades she spent locked away in a system that didn't see her as a person. I think about how easy it is to disappear someone, how simple it is to tell a lie and make it true. And I think about how many people are still out there, forgotten in places no one looks, waiting for someone to remember their name. If you've ever been told a story that didn't feel right, if you've ever had to dig through silence to find the truth, you're not alone.